Yeah, it says it's live.
Okay, let's start then. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual meeting of the Education Advisory Board. I'm Councillor Susie Horton. I'll be chairing the meeting today. It's slightly different time to normal because we changed the date, the original date, which was on the day of the big storm. Members of the public are invited to view this meeting, and if those present could be reminded to keep their microphones on mute until they're speaking, of course. Members requested, it's just me at the moment, but so that's about keeping cameras on. Okay, so I'll go through all that. So I'm just going to go through my list for attendance today. Councillor Ryan Brent is not here. Councillor Terry Norton is not here. Councillor Jeanette Smith has sent her apologies because she's had some urgent work business that's come up. Councillor Judith Smythe is not here at the moment, and if any of them arrive, I will introduce them when they do. So Mike Stoneman?
Yeah, Mike Stoneman, Deputy Director Education.
Thank you and welcome. Debbie Anderson?
Hi, Debbie Anderson, Head of School Improvement and Early Years.
Welcome, Debbie. We've got Sarah Daly.
Hi, Sarah Daly, Director of Children, Families, Education.
Welcome, Sarah. And we have Rob Sanders.
Morning, Rob Sanders, Deputy Director of the Anglican Diocese of Portsmouth.
Welcome, Rob. And Anna Martin.
Anna Martin, Democratic Services.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, so as I've said, the only apologies I've received so far are from Councillor Jeanette Smith. So I'll go on to declarations of interest, which is item 2. So my usual declaration of interest to the Vice Chair Governors at Craneswater Junior School. Any other declarations of interest?
I do inspection work for Ofsted.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. So item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 1st of November. Gosh, doesn't that go quickly? 1st of November 2021. We need to ensure that this is a correct record of the meeting. Are there any comments from anyone? No. I think it looks how I remember it, so I will approve the minutes as a correct record unless anyone has any objections, which I don't think anyone does. So those minutes are approved. Thank you, everyone. So we'll move on to item 4, which is Ofsted School Inspections Summer and Autumn Terms 2021, which I'm assuming is Debbie to present this report. And over to you, Debbie.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, I'm going to do this one. So this is an opportunity to reflect back on the inspections that have taken place in our schools across the city. Obviously, during the pandemic, Ofsted inspections were put on hold, apart from some HMI monitoring visits that initially were done remotely. A lot are based around safeguarding and also the effectiveness of remote education. And what we have done is then looked back to the summer and the autumn terms when inspections were starting again. So just to explain the difference, a Section 8 inspection, which some of our schools have, if they're good or outstanding, because inspection is proportional, the Section 8 inspections are basically asking the questions, does the school remain good or outstanding, and is safeguarding effective? And that's how it's looked upon, whereas a Section 5 inspection looks at the separate areas of judgment and overall effectiveness. So those are the two different types of inspection. So what we've done is we've produced a table on page 2 of the report to show our schools that have had inspections in that time. So obviously the UTC, theirs started as a Section 8 inspection, but it was converted. That can happen if they think the school is going to be better. That therefore you need to look at all of those areas and come out with a with a judgment. It doesn't predetermine it, but it changes, and that's what happened for the UTC, and that's where it was more of one of those sort of monitoring Section 8 visits, but turned into a full Section 5, and obviously delightedly we know that they went from inadequate to outstanding. Then through the autumn term, we had a number of schools that had mainly all Section 8 visits, inspections, and then there was one Section 5, a full inspection. And basically all of our schools that have had those visits have retained their grading as they were. The one that I've clarified in 3.3 is that there are different outcomes for those Section 8s. So there's an outcome 1 that the school remains as it was and safeguarding was effective. There's an outcome 2 saying the school remains good or good, but based on the evidence it could be even better, and Ofsted then suggests that a team comes back within 2 years to do that full Section 5. That's an outcome 2. There's an outcome 3, which is what was determined for Mainfield, to say basically on the evidence that they had, it doesn't change that current good judgment, but on the evidence of that Section 8, the inspection team were not convinced that had it been a full Section 5 it would have remained at that grading. So again they suggest a Section 5 within 2 years. So they have retained their grading. So obviously we're looking at those areas of improvement and working with the school, because we do want that to retain it. At least it's good when that team does come back. So lots of inspections, or quite a few. We haven't had any, bearing in mind this report was written for February, we haven't had, we've had one in this term since Christmas. So Cliffdale Primary had a Section 8, so that's not on the table because that's happened since, and the report has just come out and that continues to be outstanding. So it looks like all of our schools, despite it being under a new framework, are retaining, sustaining, maintaining their grading. So that's all positive. So that's where we are with, and it doesn't really massively change our percentages. We're still up in that above 90% good or an outstanding schools, 90% of children attending those good and outstanding. It just slightly varies if schools have converted or changed, or where we've had a separate Wimborne infant and junior that have become a primary. So effectively it's like closing one of those schools and the other, effectively it's been merged into that primary. But basically it's a pretty solid picture that hasn't really changed too much, which considering the pandemic is a positive picture.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that is I think that last sentence that you said is really sums up my feeling around it. And also there's a kind of national, almost like rumour that that schools who were previously outstanding were frequently being downgraded, and to see so far, nothing complacent ever, that our schools maintaining that those outstanding judgments is really heartening. Right, I can see, let me see if I think I can do this so I work out which order it is that right? I can't remember. Anyway, I think it was Rob. Was it?
Yeah, let Rob. Well, I think it could be me, but actually let Rob go first, because I've got just an additional point to make.
Rob, you go first. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, Mike did get in there before.
Sorry.
Me, so that's fine. No, I was just interested. I mean, some really positive news, so thank you for that. I was interested in the journey from inadequate to outstanding, and whether that was, I'm not so familiar with that, but in terms of whether it was to do with the safeguarding processes that meant they were inadequate, and therefore that's a relative,
very much so.
Is it something you can fix fairly quickly and then focus on your journey to outstanding in terms of curriculum and teaching and so on? Was it that kind of journey?
It was that, yeah, no, definitely that kind of journey. That's why it had got its inadequate judgment, mainly around those safeguarding things. I mean, Mike would be able to tell you as an ex-trustee, but yes, those are reasonably easy to fix, and to make sure those processes are accurate. And then, as you say, you can focus on the curriculum and teaching and learning.
Thank you. That's interesting. Thank you.
Good comment, Rob. That's really
Mm.
good. Mike, yes, I've now worked out that I can see what order people were in, so I apologise.
It's all right. No. So yeah, on the UTC journey from inadequate to outstanding, yeah, Debbie's already kind of covered it. And they were, in terms of that inspection, that where they did get inadequate, the inspector did comment on how good everything else was at the time. It was a really strong curriculum, good quality in terms of teaching and learning. So everything was in place. They were in a good place, but the safeguarding arrangements were not effective, and the Ofsted inspectors were right to make that judgment, and they've done a lot of work since then to make sure that their house is in order. The inspector did say it wasn't a situation where any children were unsafe, but clearly there was a huge risk there because their processes were not effective. The other point I just want to make about Mayfield. So obviously we are expecting Ofsted back soon, maybe by the end of this year, but certainly into next year. I think probably more likely. And the school is vulnerable, and we did announce on Friday the departure of the current head teacher, David Jeeps, and the governing board are now pressing ahead with the recruitment of a new head, which again adds more vulnerability, although provides an opportunity as well for new leadership to take the school forward into the next phase. So it's an exciting time, but also a vulnerable time. So we'll be providing support to the school and monitoring that situation very closely.
Many thanks for that, Mike. I think that's it then in terms of comments and questions. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Debbie, for presenting that report. I've just been told that Councillor Terry Norton has sent his apologies, so we'll add that to the apologies list. So we'll move on to item 5, which is I think it's Debbie again, is it? Support and challenge for LA maintained schools. So I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Susie. So yes, so this is a real focus on our LA maintained schools, the sort of support and challenge that we do for them. So I think first and foremost is that support and preparation, particularly for Ofsted. We've got a number of our LA maintained schools that were last inspected in 2017. Usually you would expect an Ofsted inspection return within 4 years, but because of the pandemic, that's been extended by 6 terms or 2 years. And the issue being that the inspection framework changed in September 2019, so there was only 6 months of it before the pandemic hit, so not a lot of time for schools to get used to being inspected under that new framework. So part of my responsibility and the work that I've been doing, the sort of imperative, is to particularly prepare our LA maintained schools for that inspection, because we will have a number that will be expecting it at any particular time. So in the beginning of January, I held quite a big training session. Initially, it was organised by the South Sea cluster, which is a strong working cluster of schools, a number that are expecting their inspections, but actually they opened it up to all of the LA maintained schools. And as I put in the report, 14 out of 18 attended that training session. And it was a good, solid morning's work. There were heads and deputies or assistant heads, and we went through a number of sort of aspects to understand the inspection framework, because I think the premise is, if you understand the detail of the inspection framework, you know what is happening during an inspection. It's not an unknown, and therefore you feel better able to be in control, to present your evidence in the way that you would want to. So that went really well. We did the understanding the inspection framework. Because I go and inspect for Ofsted myself, I was able to explain how the evidence is gathered now. So you don't have inspectors walking around with a clipboard. It is what's known as EEG, electronic evidence gathering, and it is different. But because I can understand how that evidence is gathered, hopefully that supports our schools to be in a better place to present that evidence. So that was a small little mini session, and then we also did a session on what's known as the top level view conversation, and that's that very first telephone call between the lead inspector and the head teacher, where there are a number of significant points that are that are sort of like fleshed out really, and that drive what it happens for the actual inspection when the inspectors arrive on site. So that went really well. I did a bit of sort of follow-up evaluation, and that seemed to have been really positive. And on the back of that, I have got some more sort of Ofsted type training that I've been delivering for our schools as well. So particularly understanding the Ofsted early reading deep dive, it figures massively in the quality of education judgment. So if you haven't got your early reading sorted out, then, and that's not good, it's unlikely that your quality of education will be good. And if your quality of education is good, it's unlikely your leadership and management is good, and you won't get good for overall effectiveness. So it's a sort of domino effect and stacking up. So I have been delivering training. I've done a little bit with some governors, and then I've been delivering that early reading deep dive training to senior leaders, to English leaders. Sometimes I've delivered it to a leadership team, left the PowerPoint and the notes, and then they've cascaded it to their whole staff. And then for other schools, I've done a little bit around curriculum leadership and what to expect as well. So I feel our schools are in a better place now than they were at the beginning of January, or even back in September 2019, to be prepared for their inspections. So that's been quite a big piece of work, and that's ongoing. I'm constantly getting phone calls. Can you fit this in, Debbie? Can you just do us a little bit of a recap on that? And that's absolutely fine. So pleased with that. Obviously, I've put in around moderation in assessment. That's important. That's another way we're supporting and challenging our schools. And now that we've got Sarah Hilditch working with me closely, obviously the preparation for that. And the other day we were sorting out the monitoring visits and the moderation. So that's all moving ahead. Peer review. Got a process, undertaken the training. There was one back in the autumn term for our LA maintained schools, and since then, I think last week I led my third peer review, but actually going through the whole process of a pre-review visit, really teasing out what the school wants to look into, wants to have reflected back. It's very much not a judgment, but it's an opportunity to say, you said this is going on, this is what we're seeing, tell us more about it. Is it having the effect that you want to? So I've just led the third one of the teams that I've been on, and I know somebody else is actually leading another one in a school today. So they're all proceeding. Some have had to be postponed because of staff absence and COVID, but actually the opportunity is there and they are moving ahead. So by the end of the year, hopefully we'll be able to step back and look and really evaluate and then take the process forward for next year. But at the moment, it all seems really positive about what schools are finding to have. And lots of schools have said, for 2 years we haven't had people in our classrooms. Our staff aren't used to having other people come into our classrooms. Our pupils aren't. So that's a real positive. But also having that dedicated time to have an objective view of the school and to have other people play it back to you has been really powerful as well. So that's moving on. And then from a sort of reading and literacy point of view, obviously our Destination Reader project is moving on with our 18 primary schools. So it's really sort of keeping a handle on that, checking and trying to establish, is it having the impact that we think it should do and is. It's more anecdotal at the moment and sort of like baseline and catch-up evaluation rather than hard data. But I think as we move into next year, we'll be able to look at it from that point of view a bit more. Literacy, building on the event from last year. The Year 6 project, where all of those Year 6s had a book, and we had the Michael Morpogo webinar, which is brilliant. We've got another one this year, and actually we don't want to miss a trick and not think about Year 2 to Year 3 as well, given we have so many infant and junior schools as well. So potentially what we want to do is narrow that down and then see if there's a transition unit of work like we're planning for the Year 6s for Year 2 to Year 3. Phonics, that's all moving ahead, and schools are choosing their SSPs, their systematic synthetic phonics programs. And actually the piece of work that's happened around that has been, there are so many validated programs out there, which one are you going to choose? Because it's a massive investment of finance, staff training, resources. So what's been created to support schools to make that important decision has been a useful piece of work, and our schools are doing that. And then really it is checking up on the implementation, because you can have the best program in the world, but it's the way it's delivered and implemented that will have the quality outcomes. So lots going on from a literacy point of view. Obviously Pompey Pirates have now got their second hub as well, and although that's not just our LA maintained schools, we know the focus on disadvantaged children for them is really great. So that it does include some of our LA maintained schools. They have access to that. And then something new that has only happened in this academic year is an education at SLT. Mike and my colleagues Alison and Liz, as heads of service, we've been doing a termly visit, one of us, to each of our LA maintained schools each term. Really a check-in, but really developing our relationships, our better knowledge, and having that real two-way conversation with our LA maintained schools. And lots of our LA maintained heads are saying that they now feel that they have that better working relationship with us. They're more keen to come to us to seek the advice, support and guidance, but then to embrace the challenge as well, which they wouldn't sign up to the peer review if they didn't have that strong relationship with us. So we think that's been a real development. I don't know if Mike wants to comment on that one in particular, but the heads and schools, we feel we have a better knowledge of our schools and better relationships as well.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, Debbie, and you must take a lot of credit for that, to be honest, in terms of how they feel about the local authority and the support they receive, particularly in terms of school improvement. So, but yeah, I think it's been a really good development actually, and it kind of I think it's just sort of a mature stage of the process now. We've got really good relationships with our multi-academy trusts, and obviously they have the responsibility for school improvement for those schools, but the relationship there is really strong. And I think we've come now some way in terms of that developing relationship with our local authority maintained schools, of which there are just 18 now, and I don't think that will change too much now going forward. Yeah, I think we're in a better place. So they're benefiting from the wider work in the city involving academies, but equally now we're working, I think, much better in terms of that relationship between the local authority and our maintained schools. And we've got a meeting of the maintained schools next week on the 30th of March, and we'll be looking at a kind of a memorandum of understanding or a protocol in terms of what we expect from our schools and what they can expect of us, and we'll have that discussion next week. But I think we're in a good position. Yeah.
Many thanks. That was a really great report. I just want to add a few things. It's very interesting because when I go into schools, I feel that what is positive about what we're doing in Portsmouth is we know there's good practice going on, and what we're doing with your work, particularly Debbie, around preparedness for Ofsted, is actually saying how do we make sure that we sell ourselves in the best way rather than playing an Ofsted game and then that filtering down. And I think that's really important. And just picking up on Mike's point around Portsmouth Education Partnership, I really feel is working to its maximum strengths now. It takes years to embed these things, but I think let's be honest, the pandemic really forced us to work together, and we had a really good mechanism for pulling together across the city. But that actually, as we're coming out of it, I actually think those relationships that were forged, but particularly between the academies and the LA maintained schools through the PEP, are really coming into their own. So I think that is I think those are really important things. Just a couple of other things. One is actually you mentioned about relationships, and with relationships, I think things like the relationship with the library as well as with schools and everything are really evident in that report. I mean, there's some brilliant work going on. And just a final personal point for me, and I don't know which hat I've got on here, I suppose both, is I actually went in to do a learning walk in the school where I'm a governor at. on Destination Reader, and have to say, as a former primary school teacher, I was very impressed with it. And the language, the spoken language amongst those young people was really quite mind-blowing, but also the way that they were being taken. We went to a guided reading session. The way they were taking through it, I thought, oh, I wish I'd had a lot of those strategies up my sleeve when I was in the classroom, and it was just so enjoyable. So it was nice for me to see that Destination Reader in action. So just a little bit of endorsement for on top of what Debbie said in her report. And I will stop talking and I'll go to Rob.
Thank you. And I just had a quick question around phonics. Are there many schools that aren't using a validated programme? I mean, I've come across through Ofsted feedback where one of our schools in another part of the diocese had chosen not to, and there was some concern from the inspection team about the effectiveness of what they were using. Are there any schools in Portsmouth who've got a strong view on not using a current validated programme, or is everybody looking at those?
I think initially a number of schools were, no, we've used Letters and Sounds for years, it's a programme, it works for us. But the point about the SSPs is they are validated, they've got the structure, they are robust, and everything matches. If you're a school that was getting 90% plus, your phonics results were way above, and then you had the proof of the impact that your own programme, and it wasn't an SSP, was working, then an inspection team probably wouldn't. I mean, it's not statutory that you have to have an SSP. An inspection team would probably say, well, whatever you're doing, you're getting the results, it's matching, you're doing all of that there, and you've chosen not to. But you would have to have a very clear rationale. If your results were below in 2019 and with the pandemic as well, and you weren't following an SSP, then the question would be, is the process, is the delivery, is the curriculum that you're offering the children with everything matching, enabling them to be successful early readers? And as I said, if your early reading doesn't stack up, then your quality of education doesn't stack up. So you're into that. So I think schools originally, there were a number of my schools, the LA maintained schools, that were saying, no, we're going to stick with Letters and Sounds. We don't need an SSP. I think they have changed their minds. Some of them are taking longer to choose because there are a number of validated SSPs. And, you've got to find the right one that works for you as a school. But I think everybody will probably end up going with one.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
And my advice to a school would be, if you can prove it with your results, 95% plus, if you're doing really well, when the national average was only 81, 82%, then that's not so bad. But if you're below that national average, you don't have a leg to stand on.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. That's helpful. Thank you. And just a quick question for Mike, in terms of schools and 18 remaining maintained schools and so on, but obviously there's a lot of talk about the imminent white paper. Is there any intelligence on that you're able to share, or schools' thoughts and views about what might be on the horizon? I know it's potentially difficult to comment.
Yeah, not much I can tell you, Rob. I mean, I know they're talking about those schools at the moment. Obviously, if a school is judged to be inadequate, then an academy order has to be issued, and that is still in place in terms of legislation. They are now talking about schools that are double RI that potentially might come under that kind of bracket. But apart from that, I'm not hearing anything which suggests that they're going to kind of force the academisation agenda on schools that are currently not in an academy trust. The only other aspect to it is that they're looking to try and remove single academy trusts and move them all into multi-academy trusts. So I guess there'll be that and further rationalisation. But apart from that, Rob, I don't know anything else, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think there seemed to be a little wave before the pandemic of activity, which seemed to think that they were going to come down hard. But I think maybe there's other more pressing issues. This has kind of been put on the back burner, I think. Okay, thanks again, Rob, for those questions. So I would say that the members of the Education Advisory Board note the report. And sorry, Anna, I was meant to say that for the previous item as well. we note those reports. So on to the final report, which I think Mike's going to give. And this is I think this report is going to be a really interesting historical document, actually. So the model of this report is that we've added along a timeline all sort of activity or the key highlights of the activity in relation to COVID. So we won't go through the entire report, but I'll let you focus, Mike, on the updates. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. So this will be quite a short report, to be honest. And as Susie said, what you have in front of you is all the work we've done since the pandemic started, which is quite a good historical count. I think you're right, Susie, actually, in terms of how much work and effort has gone into supporting our education settings through the pandemic. So really what I just want to cover is section 11, which just covers the spring term. And indeed, actually, since this report was written, of course, we've had the revised guidance that came in during half term, and I'll just comment briefly on that as well. So key points to note in terms of spring term. Obviously, after Christmas, we had cases rapidly rising due to the Omicron variant, and that had quite an impact on our schools. In fact, I would say the spring term, and certainly that first half of the spring term, was probably the toughest we've seen throughout the pandemic in terms of staff absence. I mean, schools were literally on their knees when we got to half term, and we had a number of examples of where schools were having to move back to remote learning, either for classes or for whole year groups, and it really was a real challenge. Now, since then, obviously, we've got the revised guidance, and whilst that has helped to a degree, we still have the guidance that means that staff and children who have tested positive are expected to self-isolate for 5 days. So that is still putting enormous pressure on our schools, and we still have schools with significant outbreaks and with significant numbers of staff absent. So we are having to watch that carefully, and only this week we've just had Manor Infant School having to close 3 classes, move to remote learning. Last week Mayfield had to close year 9, move to remote learning. So it's still really difficult out there, and until we see that guidance change, then I should imagine the rest of this half of term is going to be equally as challenging. And of course the rates are going up significantly at the moment, so that does add pressure. The other, I think, positive thing to report is in terms of the vaccinations that have been taking place across our schools. We've had pretty good take up there in terms of both the first and the second, and that's been progressing smoothly across our secondary schools. So that's been very positive to report. But apart from that, I think that probably just covers really all I can say about the spring term. We are continuing to support our schools through public health, and we've sent out regular forms of guidance. We had a letter that went out from Helen Atkinson just after half term to reflect the new guidance, but to reinforce the fact that this 5-day self-isolation, that was still in place. There was some confusion amongst parents thinking it's all finished with, we don't have to do this anymore, and obviously we had to advise accordingly. So yeah, but otherwise we are continuing to support our schools. We're hoping that there won't be too many occasions where schools are having to close year groups or classes temporarily, but I think inevitably there will be a few more examples of that.
Many thanks, Mike. And I actually think in some ways what's going on at the moment is even more difficult for schools, because there's this kind of really weird division about people thinking it's over when it obviously isn't over. And actually, whilst it is really positive that the current strain, it doesn't seem to be leading to massive hospitalization and and obviously deaths. Actually, it does make people ill, and it does impact on the workforce.
Yeah.
And I know probably like most of us on here, I know more people who got COVID this week than I did for the entire rest of the pandemic. So our thanks to all teachers and and everyone who works in schools, because I actually think it must be possibly a little bit frustrating to be working in an environment where it's all over and there's nothing in place to mitigate the spread of the infection. At the same time, they're dealing with the same real issues. So thanks to all schools on that one.
I probably should just have added, in terms of obviously the requirement for testing, asymptomatic testing, that's gone.
Mm.
Apart from our special schools where we still have that in place, and of course, and when you do have a look, our absence rates in special schools, they're not brilliant, to be honest, and that COVID is a big part of that. So that has been a challenge as well, and our special schools do provide obviously support to those children who are having to stay at home, but it's another big challenge for us, and we're hoping that obviously next term we can see those attendance rates significantly improve for our special schools, but at the moment, they're not where they need to be. They're quite poor actually overall.
So many thanks for that. Any comments, Rob, on that? It's quite straightforward.
Not for me, thank you. I acknowledge it's still a very tricky environment, absolutely. But I don't have any questions, thank you.
Thanks very much. So then I recommend to take the actions that have been taken over the last 2 years by the council, and note that, and partners to respond to the pandemic and the ongoing work that's in place in order to continue to support education settings. That's great. So I believe, according to my notes, the next meeting is Monday the 18th of July at 4 p.m. We'll confirm the location nearer the date, but it might be that we remain virtual. But we'll check in and confirm that then. So thank you so much, Rob, for coming, and for all the officers for your reports as ever. And after 40 minutes, we can call this one a day, so you get a little bit of time back. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Susie.
you.
Bye.
Bye everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.